Thank you for tuning in to The Midnight Mind. Please consider subscribing if this is your first time here, and hit the like button for me. I really would appreciate it. It's midnight, and tonight we enter the mind of Nietzsche. Millennia before Orwell's 1984, before ministries of truth and algorithmic mobs, there was an island called Corsera. It was small, sunlit, surrounded by calm seas, and it tore itself apart. Thucydides, the Athenian historian, stood witness to that destruction. He didn't write merely of politics or war. He wrote of a deeper sickness, one that begins not in weapons, but in words. He described a world where language itself was twisted until truth bled out, and virtue became indistinguishable from vice. Imagine living in a time when to lie is patriotic, when to betray is called loyalty, and to doubt is called treason. That was Corcyra, a mirror of every age that loses its grip on meaning. The Peloponnesian War was the backdrop, the war between Athens and Sparta. The real conflict took place in the minds of men. Thucydides saw what few dared to see, that civilization collapses first in language, long before it collapses in blood. Corsera was divided. Democrats siding with Athens, oligarchs with Sparta. Each side believed it fought for justice, for freedom, for truth. Yet beneath the slogans, fear and envy were the true masters. Old friends became enemies. Families turned against each other. The island descended into a fever of ideology. And the first symptom of that fever was linguistic. Thucydides writes, words had to change their ordinary meaning. And with that single line, he diagnoses not a battle between factions, but a rupture in reality itself. When words lose their meaning, thought loses its anchor. What had once been called courage became recklessness. What had been prudence was condemned as cowardice. Thucydides didn't invent this observation. He discovered it, as one might discover a law of human decay. The moment language is severed from truth, the mind follows. And when the mind loses truth, it does not descend into silence. It fills the void with noise, with slogans, dogmas, and self-righteous fury. The civil war in Corsera was, in essence, an experiment in mass psychology. Thucydides didn't moralize, he dissected. He observed how belief becomes a weapon, how virtue becomes performance. Each faction justified its cruelty by renaming it. Executions were not murders, they were acts of justice. Revenge was not hatred, it was moral duty, and in that distortion lay the seed of their ruin. For as Nietzsche would later warn, the lie is a condition of life when life no longer has the strength to face the truth. Nietzsche called this impulse resentment, the corruption of strength by envy, the transformation of weakness into moral superiority. The Corsarians, like all ideological tribes, began to love their hatred more than their cause. Each side saw itself as the victim, therefore as the righteous. Words became shields against reality, and once people no longer sought truth but emotional justification, Thucydides noted, they became readier to call wickedness noble if it served their side. In such times, reason ceases to function as a bridge between minds. It becomes another battlefield. The meaning of words is decided not by accuracy, but by allegiance. To question is to betray. To hesitate is to confess. The very structure of dialogue collapses, because language, which should be a tool of clarity, becomes an instrument of domination. Thucydides' Corcyra shows us that once meaning becomes malleable, morality itself becomes a weapon of war. Nietzsche saw in this process the death of higher values. When the herd can no longer endure truth, it rewrites it. The noble virtues, courage, moderation, honesty, are rebranded as weakness, while cunning and cruelty are recast as strength. Nietzsche said that this inversion was the transvaluation of values, and it occurs whenever man can no longer look at reality without trembling. He turns away from truth and begins to worship the lie that flatters him. In Corsera, This worship took the form of political faith. Today, it wears 1,000 new faces. Every ideology promises deliverance, yet every ideology begins by redefining words. It tells you freedom means obedience, that justice means vengeance, that unity means conformity. And as soon as you accept the new definitions, you no longer live in the same world you once did. You inhabit a linguistic prison, where every word carries an invisible command. Corsera's collapse was not an accident of war, it was a psychological inevitability. Men began to speak differently, and therefore they began to think differently. Thucydides, centuries before Nietzsche, recognized the will to illusion, the instinct to reshape truth into something bearable. He wrote not as a cynic, but as a surgeon, showing us that language is the bloodstream of civilization. Once it's poisoned, every institution, every law, every friendship becomes infected. Corsera was the prototype of every ideological state that followed, a society that forgot that meaning is sacred. So when we read Thucydides today, we are not reading history, we are looking into a mirror. The mobs have changed, the banners have changed, the weapons have evolved, but the psychology is identical. Every time emotion replaces thought, every time language bends to ideology, the same cycle begins again. It always begins innocently, with the changing of words. Thucydides saw it first. Orwell only confirmed it, and Nietzsche explained why. Because man, when faced with unbearable truth, will not rise, he will rename. The island of Corsera was not destroyed by armies, but by the slow corruption of speech. Once meaning died, everything else followed. And so begins every collapse, not with chaos, but with the quiet rewriting of reality. When words lose their meaning, conscience loses direction. That's how Thucydides describes the second stage of collapse, when men no longer know what is right, only what is useful. Corsera became a place where moderation was mocked as weakness, and extremism was praised as virtue. Every action was justified by passion, not reason. The people no longer acted from conviction, but from contagion. They repeated the words of their leaders as if language itself had become a form of possession. In this world, words no longer revealed reality, they concealed it. Justice came to mean vengeance. Freedom meant domination. Loyalty meant blind obedience. Thucydides observed this with terrifying precision. Men took upon themselves the fair name of what was most shameful, and called their recklessness courage. The shift was not merely semantic, it was spiritual. Once words lose their moral weight, the human soul floats without gravity, drifting toward whatever emotion promises belonging. Nietzsche warned that this is the inevitable result of resentment, the transformation of envy into morality. When a man feels powerless, he sanctifies his weakness. He turns his failure into righteousness and his hatred into virtue. In Corsera, the powerless and the powerful alike fell into this trap. The Democrats, claiming freedom, slaughtered their rivals in the streets. The oligarchs, claiming order, betrayed their neighbours in the night. Each side wore virtue as a mask to hide its hunger for revenge. And so language itself became an act of violence. Words no longer described the world, they created new worlds, designed to make cruelty feel sacred. Once this inversion takes hold, there is no longer truth or falsehood, only compelling myths, each demanding faith. Nietzsche saw this as the final corruption of values, when people no longer serve ideals, but use ideals to serve themselves. Thucydides watched the same phenomenon unfold centuries earlier, and knew it for what it was, the psychology of collapse. The philosopher and the historian converge on one insight, that the destruction of meaning always precedes the destruction of men. To destroy language is to erase the inner compass by which individuals judge themselves. What remains is instinct, the primal urge for power and survival, masked by noble phrases. The people of Corsera didn't set out to annihilate each other. They set out to protect what they thought was right. But once right becomes whatever serves your cause, annihilation follows naturally. Thucydides' account is not a record of madness, but of logic. When words no longer connect to reality, the only remaining authority is emotion, and emotion, once unrestrained, seeks to justify itself through destruction. Each side convinced itself that its violence was purification. They believed that they were burning away corruption, not realizing they had become the corruption itself. Nietzsche described this as the triumph of the herd, when individual conscience dissolves into collective fervour, and people kill not out of hate, but out of belief. In every age, the same pattern repeats. The crowd begins by demanding justice and ends by demanding obedience. The moral vocabulary remains, but the meanings invert. Thucydides noted that men began to praise impulsiveness as honesty and manipulation as wisdom. He saw that moral clarity had become impossible because every word had become a disguise. When all language is propaganda, sincerity itself becomes suspicious. Truth ceases to be something one seeks. It becomes something one performs. Nietzsche understood this performance as a symptom of decadence. A society that cannot face its contradictions must invent moral theatre. The loudest virtue signals hide the deepest corruption. In Corsera, as in every ideological age, purity became the new power. To appear righteous was safer than to be right, and thus began the cult of appearances. The same cult that haunts every civilization in decline. It replaces integrity with rhetoric, thought with slogans, and conscience with fear of exclusion. Thucydides saw this fear everywhere. Once language became tribal, silence became survival. To question your faction was to risk death. And so people stopped thinking altogether. They learned to repeat, to conform, to nod when they wanted to scream. Nietzsche would later call this the herd instinct, the deep animal desire for safety that masquerades as morality. It's not that people cease to believe in truth, it's that they come to believe that survival is more important than truth. When this instinct dominates, reason dies. What replaces it is the illusion of unity. A unity built on fear, not on understanding. In Corsera, men shouted the same words, not because they agreed with them, but because silence had become unbearable. And so the lie became the common language, the only language. Thucydides wrote that in the end, the human spirit was ready to commit any crime, to suffer any punishment, rather than admit defeat. Nietzsche would have smiled grimly at that line. It is the eternal confession of a man's addiction to illusion. To watch the corruption of language is to watch the slow death of the mind. It begins subtly, one word twisted, one phrase softened, one euphemism replacing another. Soon, clarity becomes dangerous, and ambiguity becomes virtue. The people of Corsera believed they were defending justice, but they were defending only their reflection of it, a reflection shaped by fear, pride, and vengeance. This, Nietzsche would say, is how all slave moralities are born. When truth becomes unbearable, men declare the lie sacred. And yet beneath this inversion lies something darker, not ignorance, but will. Nietzsche didn't see the corruption of language as a mistake. He saw it as an act of will, the will to illusion, the instinctive choice to reshape the unbearable truth into something survivable. Thucydides' Corcyra is not just a tragedy, it's a revelation of human nature. But we don't lose meaning by accident, we abandon it because meaning demands responsibility, and responsibility terrifies us. By the time the factions of Corsera realised what they had become, it was too late. Their words no longer described the world, and their minds no longer sought it. Every sentence was a weapon, every declaration a disguise. Nietzsche wrote that every profound spirit needs a mask. Thucydides showed us what happens when an entire people forgets that the mask is not the face. When the lie becomes collective, it ceases to be recognized as a lie at all. It becomes the air everyone breathes. And that is the deepest insight of Corsera's collapse. That language is not merely a means of communication, but the architecture of thought itself. Once the architecture is corrupted, reason cannot stand. When meaning fractures, morality follows. When morality fractures, identity follows. And what remains is not a society, but a collection of echoes, each one repeating a word whose meaning it no longer remembers. When Thucydides turns from Corcyra's chaos to reflection, his tone hardens. He no longer writes like a historian, he writes like a prophet. He describes a city consumed by fear, where every motive becomes suspect and every virtue becomes a disguise. Men no longer act for victory, but for destruction. They stop killing for advantage and begin killing for meaning, to prove their side righteous through blood. It's here that the final death of reason occurs, for when words have lost their meaning, violence becomes the last remaining language. Nietzsche would have recognized this perfectly. He saw that when truth dies, the will to power doesn't disappear, it metastasizes. What once expressed itself in creation now expresses itself in vengeance. When a society loses its faith in meaning, it begins to worship emotion. Fear becomes the new god, and resentment its priest. In Corsera, Thucydides wrote, "Men ceased to trust even their friends. They acted not from strategy, but from panic, destroying what they could not control." Civilization, he implies, is only the thin crust above a sea of hysteria. Fear, once unleashed, becomes self-sustaining. Every act of cruelty provokes a reaction. Every reaction justifies the next act of cruelty. The cycle no longer needs truth to sustain it. It feeds on emotion alone. Nietzsche described this as nihilism in motion, the point at which destruction becomes its own purpose. Corsera was no longer fighting a war, it was performing a ritual, a collective exorcism of its own doubt. And the more meaningless the violence became, the more necessary it felt. Thucydides writes that to revenge an injury was accounted more honourable than to refrain. It's a sentence that could be carved into the foundation of every fallen civilization. Once the idea of truth disappears, what remains is the hunger for emotional equilibrium. Men commit atrocities not because they love cruelty, but because they crave certainty. Nietzsche would call it the will to illusion, the need to make chaos bearable by wrapping it in justification. Every age of collapse begins with that need. And so, rational debate becomes impossible. Reason, which depends on shared definitions, cannot function in a world where language itself has shattered. Dialogue becomes noise, argument becomes spectacle, and truth becomes an inconvenience. The people of Corsera stopped speaking to each other and began speaking at each other. Each voice an accusation, each word a mirror turned outward. What remained of discourse was not persuasion, but domination. It was not about discovering truth, but about forcing one's version of it upon the world. If this sounds familiar, it should. For what Thucydides saw on that small island, we see everywhere today. The scale is larger, the technology more sophisticated, but the psychology is identical. Every modern conflict, political, cultural, digital, follows Corsera's pattern. Each side claims moral purity, each weaponizes language, each despises moderation. In our time, it's not swords that divide us, but words. Yet the damage is the same. The battlefield is the human mind, and the casualties are meaning, nuance, and conscience. Our media systems, like the agora of Corsera, reward extremity. Truth is too quiet to trend. Outrage travels faster, and repetition turns noise into belief. Each ideology builds its own dictionary, where old words acquire new masters. Freedom means submission to the right cause. Love means allegiance. Truth means tribal affirmation. And those who refuse to use the new language are not merely mistaken, they are heretics. As Nietzsche foresaw, once morality becomes inverted, persecution becomes a virtue. We tell ourselves that we are more enlightened, that digital mobs and political factions are nothing like ancient Corcyra. But Thucydides would disagree. He would remind us that the technology of expression may evolve, but the psychology of collapse never changes. He would tell us that man, when frightened, will trade truth for belonging. He would tell us that every civilization dies not from external conquest, but from the slow erosion of meaning within its own speech. Nietzsche called it the death of God, not merely the death of religion, but the death of shared value itself. Once the shared horizon vanishes, every word drifts without direction. Corsera's people could no longer appeal to anything beyond themselves. The same is true of us. When the sacred dies, when the transcendent ideal collapses, we invent new idols, identity, ideology, opinion, and demand that they give us purpose. But these idols cannot hold meaning. They can only consume it. Thucydides concluded that fear had replaced every other motive in Corcyra. Fear of the enemy, fear of betrayal, fear of being the last to strike. And fear, once enthroned, transforms intelligence into cunning and compassion into weakness. It replaces reason with reflex. This is the psychological mechanism of collapse, when the instinct to survive eclipses the instinct to understand. Nietzsche would say that man, unable to bear the weight of freedom, seeks refuge in chains he can worship. Modernity mirrors this precisely. We drown in words, yet starve for meaning. We speak endlessly, online, on screens, through slogans, yet each sentence feels hollow. The more we speak, the less we say. And in that noise, truth begins to fade. Like the Corcyrians, we tell ourselves that our outrage is moral, that our aggression is righteous, that our faction alone sees clearly. But underneath, we know the truth, that clarity requires solitude, and solitude is what the herd fears most. Thucydides ends his account of Corcyra with a sentence that reads like an epitaph for all civilizations. In peace and prosperity, men have better sentiments, but war takes away the easy supply of daily wants and brings out the hidden passions of human nature. He was not speaking only of war between states, but of war within the soul. The moment when necessity strips away the mask of civility, Nietzsche would have called this the return of the Dionysian, the raw, chaotic energy of existence reclaiming what culture had tried to contain. But beneath Thucydides' despair lies a warning, and perhaps a choice. Collapse is not inevitable. It begins with the smallest compromises, the careless word, the unexamined slogan, the moment we let others define our meaning for us. To resist that corruption is not to withdraw from the world, but to speak with precision, to think before we repeat, to choose truth over comfort, even when truth wounds. Nietzsche called this the courage of the higher man, the strength to bear reality without illusion. If there is salvation, it lies in that courage. It lies in reclaiming our words before they are weaponized, in restoring meaning before it decays into noise. The task is not political, but psychological. It begins the moment you refuse to lie, even when the lie is fashionable. It begins when you choose to define your words, and yourself, according to conscience, not consensus. Because, as Thucydides and Nietzsche both knew, freedom is not the absence of chains. It is the refusal to call them necessary. Civilization ends not with a bang, but with a whisper. When truth becomes optional. When speech becomes camouflage. When men forget that words are sacred. Corcyra was not an anomaly. It was a prophecy. Every age thinks it's different, but the pattern is always the same. First we change the words, then the words change us. If you have any thoughts on today's episode, I'd love to hear them. Leave me a message in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. Consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys next time.